My husband's casket was still warm when his brother stood up in the front pew of Trinity Church and told the mourners that he would be taking over Whitman Industries. He said it like a kindness. He said it like he was sparing me. He smoothed his charcoal lapel, turned a quarter-degree toward the center aisle so the cameras from the Boston Globe and the Boston Business Journal could see his face in three-quarter profile, and he spoke for 91 seconds. I timed him. The acoustics in Trinity Church are forgiving, and his voice carried clearly to the back row. He had been planning that sentence for 18 months. He had been planning the theft for 24 years. What he did not know, what David never told him, what no one in that church except me and one attorney sitting in the third row of the South Transept had ever known, was that in 1998, my husband moved 51% of the voting trust of Whitman Industries into my name. Irrevocable. Sole trustee. The signing was logged at 3:42 on the afternoon of June 12, 1998, at the private estate of Charles Pelletier Sr. in Cohasset, Massachusetts. The company Richard was promising the room he would inherit was not his to inherit. It was mine. It had been mine for the entire adult life of my brother-in-law's children. My name is Margaret Eleanor Whitman. I was born Margaret Holloway in Brookline in March of 1959. I am 67 years old. I graduated from Wellesley College in 1981 with a double major in biology and economics, and from Harvard Business School in 1984. In January of 1985, in a rented garage on Binney Street in Cambridge, I co-founded a medical device company with my husband, David Andrew Whitman. We started with 4 employees, 1 provisional FDA pathway, and a 6-figure line of credit from my late father's commercial bank. 41 years later, the morning of David's funeral, that company was valued at $320 million. The controlling 51% of the voting trust, $163 million in shareholder value, had been held in my name for 28 of those years. Richard did not know. The world did not know. David's son Tyler, my stepson, who Richard had been quietly working on for 10 years with the promise that Tyler would inherit the chief executive office, did not know. At 3:46 on the afternoon of May 14th, 2026, in the marble nave of Trinity Church on Copley Square, my brother-in-law promised 600 mourners that he would be taking over a company that had not been his to take over since the spring of his 34th year. At 9:17 the next morning, in a glass-walled boardroom on the 12th floor of 245 Northern Avenue in the Seaport District of Boston, the irrevocable trust David signed on his 43rd birthday was opened and read aloud by the only attorney in the world who had ever held a key to it. The vote that followed took 4 minutes. Tonight I am going to tell you how we got there. I am going to tell you what David found out in 1998 and what he decided to do about it. I am going to tell you about Lila Park, who I hired in 2010 and who quietly audited my brother-in-law's transactions every 90 days for 14 years without him ever once suspecting it. And I am going to tell you about the discipline of silence. I met David Whitman in the fall of 1979, the September of my junior year at Wellesley. He was a 4th-year doctoral candidate in biomedical engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he had come to give a guest lecture in my Biology of Surgical Instrumentation seminar, a course that did not, strictly speaking, exist on the Wellesley catalog. It was a cross-registered MIT elective I had petitioned into the previous spring because I had decided in the 2nd semester of my sophomore year that I was going to start a medical device company, and I had decided that I would marry the right co-founder to do it with. I am telling you this in order. in the way it happened because I want you to understand what kind of woman I was at 20 years old. I was not romantic. I was deliberate. David lectured for 50 minutes on the polymer interface problem in titanium orthopedic implants. He took 3 questions. He answered mine last. He asked me afterward in the hallway of the Whitman Observatory building whether I would like to have dinner. I said yes. We had dinner that Friday at a Greek restaurant in the South End. By the end of the meal, he had drawn the preliminary schematic of a self-retaining surgical retractor on the back of the paper placemat, and I had outlined the regulatory pathway I believed would be required to bring it to market. The placemat is in a frame in our library on Mount Vernon Street. It has been there since 1986. We married at Trinity Church, Copley Square in June of 1983. I was 24. David was 28. The reception was held at the Boston Athenaeum on Beacon Street, which is 2 blocks from the house his parents owned, and which his grandfather had owned, and which his great-grandfather had built in 1871. The Whitmans were the kind of Boston family that does not draw attention to being a Boston family. Old paper money, old discretion. David's father, Andrew, was a partner at a private trust company on State Street that does not have a sign on its door. His mother, Patricia, served on the boards of 3 museums and 1 hospital and chaired none of them. David had a younger brother, Richard, who was 16 years old at our wedding and who got drunk at the reception on champagne his mother had explicitly forbidden him to drink, and who I had to physically take outside and walk around the Athenaeum portico for 40 minutes until he could stand without listing. That was the first conversation I ever had with Richard Whitman. It is not the conversation I think about most, but it is the one that comes back to me now. I finished my MBA at Harvard Business School in May of 1984. By that summer, David and I had filed the provisional patent on the retractor we had drawn on the placemat. By December, we had leased a 1,300 square foot industrial bay on Binney Street in Cambridge, what is now the heart of Kendall Square, but in 1984 was a half-vacant block of converted warehouses. And we had moved in 4 folding tables, 2 prototyping benches, and 1 used FDA regulatory consultant from Concord. Whitman Industries was incorporated on January 8, 1985. My signature is on the founding documents in 3 places. I held 38% of the original common stock. David held 45%. The remaining 17% was issued to a Boston angel investor named James Donegal, who took it in exchange for $220,000 and who is now 71 years old and who still sits on our board. 41 years later, the morning of my husband's funeral, Jim Donegal sent me a single text message at 6:12 in the morning. It read, "The chair is yours." He meant my husband's. He was wrong, but he did not yet know it. I had not sat in that chair in 28 years. I was not going to start sitting in it now. Whitman Industries cleared its first FDA 510K submission in March of 1990. The product was an orthopedic Kirschner wire, a 1.6 millimeter stainless steel pin used in pediatric fracture repair. By the end of that fiscal year, we had 3 contract manufacturers, 18 employees, and $470,000 in revenue against $210,000 in cost of goods sold. We were not yet a real company. We were, as David liked to say, a company in the imperative tense, a company about to be. By 1992, we had moved into a 20,000 square foot facility at 75 Binney Street, 2 doors down from the original garage. We had 35 employees. We had cleared 2 additional 510Ks. Our revenue had crossed $3 million. David ran research and development and external partnerships. I ran regulatory compliance, employee benefits, the relationship with our Boston angel investor, and what I would later come to think of as the unwritten constitution of the company, the assumptions about how we treated suppliers, how we paid late, how we hired, how we fired. I was 33 years old. I was tired. In 1993, I gave birth to a stillborn son at 31 weeks. I did not return to the office for 14 months. When I came back, in the spring of 1995, I came back as a board member and as the unpaid chief compliance officer of a company that now had 92 employees, and I did not come back as an operating executive. I told David I was finished with daily operations. I told him I wanted a controller. I told him I wanted an internal audit function. What David did instead, in October of 1995, was hire his brother. Richard was 32 years old. He had graduated from Boston College in 1985, 5 months after Tyler was born, 4 months before David's divorce from Caroline Pemberton was finalized, and he had spent the intervening decade at the audit practice of Price Waterhouse, which became PricewaterhouseCoopers in his 8th year there. He had made senior manager. He had not made partner, and the year before he came to us, he had been passed over a second time. His career inside PwC was, as the partners politely put it in the exit conversation his father later told me about, not on a clear trajectory. I did not want to hire him. I told David, in the kitchen of our house on Mount Vernon Street, on the Sunday before David made the offer, that I did not believe Richard had the temperament to run the financial operations of a company built from money we had personally bled to raise. I told David I had watched Richard at 3 Whitman family Thanksgivings, and at the wedding 10 years earlier, and at the funeral of David's father in 1993, and that Richard had a particular quality I did not have a clean word for then, but which I would later come to recognize as the quality of a man who believes he is owed. David did not disagree with me. He said only that his mother had asked. He said that his father, in the last conversation they had before the stroke that killed him, had asked David to find a place in the company for his younger brother. He said it was the only thing in his life he could not say no to. Richard joined Whitman Industries as Chief Financial Officer on October 2nd, 1995. His starting salary was $140,000. He was issued no founder's stock and no founder's options. He was given the title and the corner office on the second floor, and he was given the keys to the wire transfer authorization protocol, and I sat in the parking lot of the Binney Street building in my Volvo station wagon the morning he started, and I watched him walk in through the front door, and I knew, without language for it, that I had just lost the argument that mattered most. The wire transfer I am about to describe to you cleared on the morning of February 6, 1998. The amount was $311,400. The originating account was a Whitman Industries operating account at the State Street Commercial Bank, where my father had once been Senior Vice President of Credit. The destination was a numbered correspondent account at the Singapore branch of a Swiss private bank, held in the name of an entity called Pacific Rim Consulting Private Limited. I did not discover the wire on the morning it cleared. I discovered it 19 days later, on February 25th, while I was reviewing the previous month's bank reconciliations as part of the unpaid compliance audit I had performed quarterly since 1996. I had a standing routine. On the last Friday of every third month, I drove from Beacon Hill to the Binney Street office at 6 in the morning, before any employee arrived, and I sat in the conference room across from David's office, and I read through the prior quarter's bank statements, line by line. I did not tell Richard I did this. I did not tell anyone except David. It was, as far as the company's organizational chart was concerned, a courtesy review by a co-founder who happened to also be a board member. In the line items for February of 1998, I found a single wire transfer of $311,400 coded against an internal cost center labeled Pacific Patent Prosecution, authorized by the Chief Financial Officer, with a transmittal memorandum that referenced a Singaporean intellectual property law firm I had never heard of, and which our actual outside patent counsel, Wolf Greenfield and Sachs of Boston, confirmed by phone that afternoon they had never coordinated with. I drove back to the Binney Street office at 4:30 that afternoon. I sat in David's office with the door closed for 1 hour and 20 minutes. I laid out the bank statement, the internal authorization memorandum, the bogus law firm letterhead Richard had attached to the wire authorization, and the response email from Wolf Greenfield denying any knowledge of Pacific Rim Consulting Private Limited. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I told my husband that his brother had stolen $311,400 from our company, that the structure of the theft suggested it was not the first attempt and would not be the last, and that he needed to decide in the next 48 hours what kind of company we were going to be. David did not argue with me. David did not say that I might be wrong, or that there might be an explanation, or that we should give Richard the chance to explain himself. He looked at the documents. He read them twice. He said, after a long silence, "I cannot fire him. My father asked me not to." I said, "Then we need to make sure he cannot do it again." David said, "How?" I told him. On the night of February 25th, 1998, at the kitchen counter of our house at 18 Mount Vernon Street, I outlined for my husband the structure of a trust I had been thinking about for 2 years and had not yet found an occasion to propose. I drew it on a yellow legal pad. I made David read it back to me to make sure he understood the mechanism. He understood it. He said yes. We did not speak about Richard again for 107 days. We did not fire him. We did not confront him. We did not change his title, or his salary, or his corner office on the second floor. We let him believe that the February wire had cleared without notice, and we waited, and we built the legal architecture that would, 28 years later, make the second most important meeting of my life take 4 minutes to conclude. That was the morning I knew our marriage had 2 sides, and one of them was paperwork. Charles Pelletier Sr. was 70 years old in the spring of 1998, and he had been our family's attorney for 7 of those years. He had retired from his firm's downtown office 3 years earlier and now took only a handful of long-standing private clients, whom he met at his weekend house on the inner harbor of Cohasset, Massachusetts, a gray shingled colonial built in 1896 that smelled, year-round, of beeswax and salt and the particular kind of old paper that only law firms accumulate. David and I drove down to Cohasset on the morning of June 12th, 1998, which was David's 43rd birthday. We did not tell anyone we were going. Richard was at the Binney Street office in the middle of the second quarter close. Our housekeeper believed we were attending a daytime concert at Tanglewood. David's mother believed we were having lunch with the chairman of our angel investors' family office. No one knew where we actually were. Charles met us at the door in a navy cardigan and the kind of soft leather slippers a man wears in his own house when he is no longer interested in performing for the world. He had laid out the documents on the dining room table. The trust was 31 pages. It had been drafted over a period of 17 weeks. It had been reviewed by 2 other partners at Charles's old firm, both bound by attorney-client privilege, both retired, both now deceased, and by a federal tax specialist in New York whom Charles trusted with his own estate. The instrument was titled the David Andrew Whitman Voting Trust of 1998. The corpus consisted of the common stock that, in combination with our angel investors' shares and three small subsequent issuances, constituted 51% of the voting equity of Whitman Industries, Incorporated. The trust was irrevocable. The sole trustee was Margaret Eleanor Whitman. The successor trustee, in the event of my death or incapacity, was a Boston-based corporate trustee, a department of a private bank, which would administer the trust under written instructions filed at the time of execution. The economic beneficiary, for income and dividend purposes during David's lifetime, remained David. On David's death, the economic beneficiary would become me. What the trust accomplished was simple to describe and almost impossible to undo. While David was alive, he would continue to draw the income from his shares as he always had. He would continue to vote them at board meetings as he always had, because I had given him, at the time of execution, an irrevocable proxy to vote the trust shares at his discretion for any reason until his death. He could, in other words, run the company exactly as he had been running it. Nothing would change in operations. Nothing would change at the annual meeting. The trust would sit dormant and invisible in the safety deposit box of a small trust company in Wellesley that had once been my mother's bank. The day David died, however, the proxy expired. The voting power of 51% of Whitman Industries would, on that day, revert to me alone, not to David's estate, not to David's son Tyler, not to David's brother Richard, not to anyone except the sole trustee named on the document. David signed each page at 3:38 in the afternoon. I countersigned at 3:41. Charles dated and witnessed both signatures at 3:42. We sealed the original instrument in a cream-colored envelope, pressed Charles's old firm's wax seal onto the flap, and drove from Cohasset to the trust company in Wellesley in time to lodge the envelope in the safety deposit box at 4:45 before the bank closed at 5. On the drive home from Wellesley to Beacon Hill that evening, David said almost nothing. As we crossed the Charles River on the Massachusetts Pike, he said one sentence: "If I die before he stops, you will know what to do." I said, "Yes." I did not have to ask which he meant. Richard did not stop. I will not pretend I expected him to. In the 12 months following the February 1998 wire transfer that he believed had cleared without notice, Richard executed 7 additional payments to 4 additional consulting entities he had registered in his own name and in his wife's name in 3 offshore jurisdictions. The cumulative amount of those payments was $1,180,000. The cumulative amount, by the time we reached the end of 1999, was $1,740,000. By the end of 2000, it was $2,100,000. He was learning. He was getting better. He was, as the agency that would eventually investigate him later put it in the indictment paperwork, scaling. I tracked every payment. I kept the records in a locked drawer of the desk in my study at Mount Vernon Street. I did not at first have a system. I had legal pads. I had marked up bank statements. I had folders organized by quarter and by Richard's escalating creativity. By the spring of 2010, I had filled 4 bankers' boxes, and David and I sat down in my study one Saturday morning and agreed that I needed help. The help I hired was a 40-year-old certified public accountant named Lila Park. Lila had grown up in Cambridge. Her father was a Korean-American chemist at the Polaroid Corporation in the years when the Polaroid Corporation still made cameras, and she had spent 18 years at the audit practice of PwC. She had quit in the autumn of 2009, in the 3rd year of the recession, because she had decided that she did not want to spend the second half of her career signing audit opinions for companies whose chief financial officers she did not trust. She had 3 children. She had a private forensic accounting practice she ran out of a small office on Summer Street in Boston with 1 paralegal and 1 part-time analyst. I retained her on April 2nd, 2010. The engagement letter said her work was to be performed at the personal request of Margaret Eleanor Whitman, an individual, and that her work product was to be the sole property of Margaret Eleanor Whitman, and that no part of her work was to be disclosed to or shared with Whitman Industries, Incorporated, or any officer, employee, or board member of Whitman Industries, Incorporated, including David Andrew Whitman, except by the explicit written instruction of Margaret Eleanor Whitman. David knew Lila existed. David knew what Lila did. David never read a single one of her reports. I asked him once, in 2012, whether he wanted to. He said no. He said his job was to keep the company alive and growing. He said my job was to make sure that when the day came that he could no longer keep it alive, the company would still be ours. For 14 years, Lila Park audited Richard's transactions every 90 days. She did not miss a quarter. She built, over those 14 years, a forensic ledger that ultimately ran to 920 pages, cross-indexed against 8 bank jurisdictions and 23 shell entities. She traced $4,200,000 in 1999 through 2003, $11 million in 2004 through 2010, $16 million in 2011 through 2020. By the end of 2024, the cumulative amount Richard had moved was $31,800,000. He did not know we were watching. He thought he had been clever. What he had actually been, for 24 years, was the unknowing subject of one of the most patient internal investigations a privately held medical device company has ever conducted on one of its own officers. The investigators were 2, a CPA in a small office on Summer Street, and a 67-year-old woman in a Beacon Hill brownstone who never raised her voice and who had once, at 20 years old, decided that she was going to start a medical device company and choose the right co-founder to do it with. The discipline of silence is not glamorous. It is mostly tedious, but it is, in the end, the discipline that wins. David was diagnosed with stage 3 pancreatic adenocarcinoma on November 14, 2024, at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. We had been told to expect the diagnosis 4 days earlier, after the second of 2 contrast MRIs and 1 endoscopic biopsy at Brigham and Women's Hospital. We were not surprised. We were not, in any meaningful emotional register, ready. There is no version of being ready. The oncologist's name was Sarah Whittington. She was 46 years old. She had been recommended to us by Dr. Sarah Chen, our company's chief medical officer, who serves on the medical advisory board of Dana-Farber, and who, when I called her at 6:15 on the morning of November 10th to tell her what we suspected, did not waste a single sentence on consolation. She gave us a name. She gave us a phone number. She said, "Tell her I sent you. She will see you tomorrow." Dr. Whittington gave David a median survival estimate of 12 to 18 months with full-dose chemotherapy and a probable surgical intervention to debulk the primary mass. She gave him, without chemotherapy, 4 to 7 months. David asked exactly one clinical question. He asked whether he would be cognitively impaired by the chemotherapy. She said the regimen she was proposing would not cross the blood-brain barrier in a clinically meaningful way, and that he would remain himself, mentally, until the late stage of decline. He said, "Then yes." He did not consult me before he answered. I did not need him to. We drove home to Mount Vernon Street that afternoon. We did not call Tyler. We did not call David's sister Patricia in Newport. We did not call Richard. We sat in the kitchen at the same counter where, in 1998, I had drawn the structure of the voting trust on a yellow legal pad. David made tea. I made a list. The list had 3 columns. Column 1 was the people who would need to be told and in what order. Column 2 was the operational decisions at Whitman Industries that would need to be sequenced in the next 18 months. Succession communications, the second quarter board off-site, the chairmanship of the audit committee, the renewal of our distribution agreement with the Cleveland Clinic system. Column 3, which I wrote in pencil rather than ink, was the list of things Richard was about to do. I knew what Richard was about to do because I had been watching him do smaller versions of it for 26 years. He was about to interpret David's mortality as his own promotion. He was about to begin gathering the documentation that would, in his own internal narrative, make him the natural and obvious successor to his brother. He was about to begin manipulating Tyler, and he was, almost certainly, going to attempt, within 90 days, to obtain durable power of attorney over David's personal and corporate affairs, on the grounds that it would be a kindness to a dying man and a relief to me. He attempted it on December 18th, 2024, 5 weeks after the diagnosis. He came to our house at 4 in the afternoon in a charcoal overcoat with a manila folder and a notarized template he had downloaded from a Massachusetts elder law website and customized in his own hand. He sat in our library. He spoke to David for 40 minutes about how much he loved him, about how much he wanted to shield me from the burden of the company's day-to-day decisions during what he called this period, about how he had taken the liberty of drafting a simple instrument that would allow him to step in if and when David could not. David let him finish. David did not interrupt. David did not raise his voice. David said, "Richard, Margaret has had my full proxy on every business and personal matter for 26 years. There is nothing for you to step into. Thank you for thinking of us." Richard left at 5:12. He did not come back to the house for another 5 weeks. When the front door closed behind him, David turned to me in the library and said, "Begin." I picked up the phone and I called Lila Park. November of 2024, the diagnosis, stage 3. Lila Park spent the first 6 weeks of 2025 organizing what she and I would, between ourselves, refer to from then on as the death dossier. The phrase was not sentimental, it was clinical. The death dossier was the consolidated, indexed, exhibit-ready summary of every transaction Richard Whitman had executed against Whitman Industries, Incorporated, between February 6, 1998 and December 31st, 2024, together with the corroborating bank records, wire memoranda, shell entity registrations, and forensic accounting analyses Lila had built in the 14 years she had been working for me. It was a single document of 923 pages, bound in 2 black accordion folders and a redundant encrypted digital archive held on 2 air-gapped solid-state drives, one of which lived in the safety deposit box in Wellesley alongside the original 1998 trust instrument, and one of which lived in a locked file cabinet in Lila's office on Summer Street. Richard, in 2025, did 3 things, in roughly the order I had predicted in the 3rd column of the list I had drawn at the kitchen counter the night of David's diagnosis. First, he escalated the embezzlement. Over the calendar year of 2025, he moved an additional $11,200,000 out of Whitman Industries' operating accounts and into a new shell entity registered in the Cayman Islands and styled as a supply chain restructuring reserve. He did this through 6 wire transfers between March and November, each one structured to fall just below an internal threshold he believed I did not know existed and which Lila had been monitoring since 2012. Second, he attempted a second power of attorney instrument. This one was more sophisticated than the first. He had retained a Boston attorney, not Charles Pelletier Jr., who would not have taken the engagement, but a contracts associate at a mid-size Back Bay firm, to draft what was, on its face, a perfectly anodyne springing power of attorney that would only take effect upon David's certified medical incapacity. He presented it to David on June 17th, 2025, in the same library, in the same charcoal overcoat. David refused it a second time. David did not raise his voice the second time either. What David did do, the morning of June 18th, was telephone Lila Park. He asked her, in language I do not need to paraphrase here, to formalize the dossier. He asked her to make it ready. He asked her to be prepared, on a day she would not know in advance, to bring it to a room. She said yes. Third, he began, that summer, to work on Tyler. Tyler was 39 years old. He was a Wharton MBA. He had joined Whitman Industries in 2018 as Vice President of Strategy on a direct recommendation from his father, and he had performed well in that role for 6 years. He had also grown up in a house his father had moved out of when he was 2 years old, in a family in which his stepmother was a woman he had been taught, first by his biological mother, and then, more quietly and more efficiently, by his uncle, to view with civility and emotional distance, and a vague background suspicion that I had married his father for reasons that were not exclusively romantic. Richard's approach to Tyler in 2025 was patient and well rehearsed. Richard told Tyler, in a series of dinners at a restaurant in the Seaport, that I would later be able to date, to the exact week from Tyler's expense reports, that Tyler was the natural successor to the Whitman family business. Richard told Tyler that I would, in all probability, attempt to seize operational control of the company in the immediate aftermath of David's death, on the strength of my legacy founder status, and that Richard was the only person in the family who could ensure that Tyler's birthright was protected. Richard told Tyler that he, Richard, would step in as interim chief executive officer for 2 years, that he would mentor Tyler personally during that transition, and that he would name Tyler chief executive officer on his 40th birthday. Tyler believed him. He believed him for 10 months. He believed him on the morning of May 14th, 2026, when he sat in the second pew of Trinity Church, 2 rows behind his uncle, and watched Richard rise to speak. He believed him at 3:46 that afternoon, when the 91 seconds began. He believed him through the recessional. He believed him through the reception. He stopped believing him at 9:21 the next morning, but that is a story for the section that follows. David died at 4:17 in the morning of May 9th, 2026, in the small bedroom on the second floor of the Mount Vernon Street house that we had converted, in January, into a home hospice suite. He died holding my hand. The hospice nurse was in the kitchen. The house was quiet. The pancreatic mass had metastasized through the omentum and the liver in the 8 weeks prior. The last sentence he spoke aloud, 2 days before, was the sentence about Pelletier and Lila and letting Richard speak first. I have already told you that sentence. I will not repeat it. The funeral was held at Trinity Church, Copley Square at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on May 14th. Trinity Church is a Henry Hobson Richardson Romanesque revival building completed in 1877. The nave seats approximately 1,500. We had invited 650 mourners by hand-addressed letter mailed from the funeral home on May 10th. 628 attended. I sat in the front pew on the gospel side, between my stepson Tyler on my right and David's sister Patricia on my left. Charles Pelletier Jr., 58 years old, the only attorney in the world who held a key to the 1998 instrument, sat in the third row of the south transept where I had asked him to sit, dressed in a charcoal suit, holding a slim leather portfolio that contained a single sealed envelope. Father Andrew Coughlin, the rector of Trinity, gave the homily. He had known David for 19 years. He spoke for 14 minutes. He did not mention the company. He did not mention Richard. He spoke about the discipline of a long marriage, about the moral architecture of building something with another person, about the quiet kind of integrity that does not require an audience. It was the homily I would have asked for if I had been able to ask for one. The eulogy was given by James Donegal, our angel investor from 1985, who was 71 years old and who spoke for 11 minutes from the pulpit with the dry steadiness of a man who has buried his closest friend and has decided not to perform his grief in public. He said, "David Whitman built a company because his wife asked him to. Anything you think you know about Whitman Industries that begins with David begins, in fact, with Margaret." I did not turn my head. I was aware of Richard, on the right side of the front pew, hearing that sentence. At 3:46 in the afternoon, after the second hymn and immediately before the recessional, Richard stood up. He had not been scheduled to speak. He had not been asked to speak. He turned a quarter degree toward the center aisle. He smoothed his lapel. He addressed the nave. He said, "Friends, family, colleagues, my brother David built something extraordinary, and what mattered most to him was that it continue. I have spoken with the board. I have spoken with the family. I will be taking over Whitman Industries, effective immediately, and out of love for my brother and for everything he gave us, we will continue. We will grow. We will honor him." 91 seconds. I timed him. I did not stand. I did not turn. I did not interrupt. I let him finish. When he sat down, in the silence that followed, and which Father Coughlin allowed to last, I reached across Tyler, took Tyler's hand for the first time in 14 years, and squeezed it once. Tyler did not look at me. Tyler did not understand. Tyler thought, in that moment, that I was the one being broken. The recessional began. We followed the casket down the center aisle to the west doors of Trinity Church. The Boston Globe photographer, who I had been told would be present, took the photograph that would run on page B1 of the Saturday edition under the headline, "Medical Device Founder Mourned at Copley." The photograph shows me from behind. It shows Richard 3 paces ahead of me, walking with his hand on the rail of the casket. It shows Tyler beside me. It shows Charles Pelletier Jr. in the third row of the south transept, watching us pass. He is the only person in the photograph who is looking at me. He nodded once. I nodded back. We had a meeting in 15 hours and 44 minutes. The emergency board meeting of Whitman Industries, Incorporated, was convened at 9:17 in the morning on May 15, 2026, in the 12th floor glass-walled boardroom of our headquarters at 245 Northern Avenue in the Seaport District of Boston. 12 directors were present. Charles Pelletier Jr. was present as sole outside counsel on my written authorization, displacing the firm Richard had assumed would be advising the board. Lila Park was present as a non-voting witness, with her 2 accordion folders on the credenza behind her. Richard arrived at 9:11. He was wearing the same charcoal suit. He carried a leather binder embossed with his initials. The binder, I would later learn from Lila's quiet reconnaissance of his office that morning, contained a fully drafted succession plan in which he was named interim chief executive officer for a term of 24 months, with Tyler designated as chief executive officer effective on Tyler's 40th birthday, which would have fallen on the 11th of November 2026. The plan included an immediate 50% compensation adjustment for Richard, a deferred equity grant of $1.8 million in restricted stock, and a clause indemnifying the chief financial officer for all prior actions taken in good faith on behalf of the corporation. I sat in my usual board seat, second from the head of the table on the gospel side, where I had sat at every meeting for 38 years. I did not sit in David's chair. David's chair, at the head of the table, was empty. I had asked the facilities team the evening before to leave it empty. Richard moved to take it. Jim Donegal, our board chair, raised his hand and said, "Richard, please sit in your usual seat. Council has an opening matter." Richard sat. The room was silent for perhaps 11 seconds. Charles Pelletier Jr. rose from his chair on the side of the table reserved for outside advisors. He carried the leather portfolio. He opened it. He laid the cream-colored envelope with its 1998 wax seal intact on the polished walnut surface in front of David's empty chair. He said, "Pursuant to the terms of the David Andrew Whitman Voting Trust of 1998, executed at 3:42 in the afternoon on June 12th of that year, and lodged with the Wellesley College Trust Company on the same afternoon, I am required, upon the death of Mr. Whitman, to read into the record the names of the sole trustee, the voting block, and the controlling proxy of the equity covered." He read the trust. It took 2 minutes and 41 seconds. He read it slowly. He read it clearly. When he reached the line naming Margaret Eleanor Whitman as the sole trustee of 51% of the voting stock of Whitman Industries, Incorporated, he paused exactly long enough to allow the table to look at me, and then he continued. Richard did not move. Richard did not, for the first time in the 62 years of his life that I had personally observed, find anything to say. At 9:21, Jim Donegal made a motion. He moved that Richard James Whitman be terminated as Chief Financial Officer of Whitman Industries, Incorporated, effective immediately, for cause, with the specific basis of the for-cause determination to be referred to a special committee of independent directors for full investigation, and that a federal criminal referral be authorized to the United States Attorney for the District of Massachusetts. Dr. Sarah Chen seconded the motion. The vote was called. The result was 9 in favor, 2 opposed, both Richard's own appointees from 2018, 1 abstention from Tyler, who was, in that moment, no longer capable of speech. The motion carried at 9:25. 4 minutes. Tyler stayed in the conference room after the meeting adjourned. He sat in his chair for 46 minutes. At 10:11, he walked the length of the table, sat down in the seat beside mine, and said, "How long did you know?" I said, 28 years. He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because you were a child, and then you were a young man, and then you were the son of a dying father, and there was never a moment when telling you would not have cost more than it would have saved. I am sorry." He cried. He had not cried at the funeral. He cried in the boardroom for 19 minutes. I sat beside him. I did not speak. The discipline of silence had one final use. On May 22nd, Tyler came to the Mount Vernon Street house. He apologized. He asked to be reinstated as vice president of strategy on his original terms. I told him yes. I told him he would report directly to me as interim chief executive officer until the board completed its succession process. I told him I would not hold the office for long. I told him that, if he did the work, I would recommend him for the office by the fall of 2027. He did the work. Richard was formally indicted by a federal grand jury on September 18, 2026. 47 counts of wire fraud, one count under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The plea deal was accepted by Judge Cynthia Marchetti at the John Joseph Moakley United States Courthouse on March 3, 2027. 6.5 years at the Federal Correctional Institution at Fort Dix, New Jersey. $42 million in restitution, secured against assets the federal government seized in June. In September of 2027, the board of Whitman Industries named Tyler Whitman Chief Executive Officer. I stepped back to a board-only role. I drove down to Cohasset that weekend, alone, to the gray-shingled colonial on the Inner Harbor where Charles Pelletier Sr. signed our trust in 1998. The house belongs now to his son. He let me in. I sat in the dining room with a cup of tea. I walked the dunes at the end of his property for an hour. The Atlantic in late September is the color of slate. The chair David sat in for 41 years has been empty for 1 year and 4 months. It will not be empty much longer.